morning, everyone.
Good morning.
My name is Barbara Cass, and I am the branch chief in the facility licensing. No, that's new now. I used to be the section chief. I have a new job. I am the branch chief in the healthcare quality and safety branch within the Department of Public Health, and within that branch lives the facility licensing and investigation section. And to my left,
Hi, I'm Alicia Gaduti. I'm the president and CEO of the Connecticut Council of Family Service Agencies. We are a provider network of 15 nonprofit human service agencies whose missions are to serve kids and families.
And I'm Jim McPherson from the Department of Children and Families, and I oversee our licensing unit, which is responsible for licensing group homes, shelters, residential facility for kids, in addition to a number of community-based outpatient programs.
I'm Stan Sobey with Oak Hill. Oak Hill is a multi-service provider across the state, serving people with intellectual and other disabilities, including a special education school program, assistive technology center, a fully accessible sports and fitness center, and camp programs, and probably 3 or 4 things that I'm forgetting right offhand. But we serve thousands of people over the course of a year.
Yeah,
Stephen,
we cannot see.
Okay. I'm Amber Wett. I'm fortunate to be the CEO of CCARC. Say that 10 times. We are a nonprofit provider that primarily contracts with the Department of Developmental Services. Been with the agency for about 24 and a half years. Who's counting though, right? We provide both day and residential services to over 200 people within primarily the New Britain, Berlin, Middletown, a pretty broad geographic area in central Connecticut. So we are one of those agencies that is licensed by the Department of Developmental Services, and excited about the partnership that we've had through this lean process. So we're doing this all together, partnering.
That's right. Hi, I'm Josh Galora from DDS. We are not dentists. So at DDS, we support individuals and families with intellectual disability to really be engaged and full participants in our community life and lead the same rich, full, integrated experiences that we all get to do. And I'm very fortunate to be up here with wonderful state agency partners and our private agency partners as well, our nonprofit providers. We're really excited to see you here today. Thanks for coming.
so because Josh is not a dentist, I don't have to check his license.
You do not. Thank you.
Yeah. So again, we're here to talk about Special Act 17-21. And the genesis is bringing not-for-profits and state agencies together to see where we could lean our processes. And as we advance through our slides, Stan is going to talk in much greater detail about the Special Act. But the real epiphany for me was, could state agencies and could not-for-profit providers come together in the same room and reach consensus? And I think collectively we're all here to tell you we can, and it works. So when Special Act 17-21 was promulgated, we heard a little bit about faces and how does change make you feel. So when this was promulgated, I had kind of a flat smile. But after all of the work, I can tell you I had a very happy smile, because really, really good work and exciting work has been done. It's really, really important for us to call out who the team members were. And I do want to read the definition of a friend, because all of the people on this slide, I believe, are my friends now. I'm not sure if Secretary Barnes thinks he's my friend, but I think he's my friend. So Merriam-Webster defines friends as persons who keep or support when forced into change. And we were forced into change, so these are all my friends. Again, DPH, me, Alice Martinez, and our 2 government liaisons, Bree and Jill. Demas, we had Natasha Kennedy, Erin Levitt-Smith, Jeremy Wampler, and Stephanie Guest, DCF, the infamous Jim McPherson, who everybody loves, and Jimmy Moore. Jimmy Moore is just great. DDS is Josh, Claudine and Christine Polio, who has now moved on to another job, but
Yes.
was integral in lots of very, very instrumental work that was done legislatively. And then DAS was Kimberly Ware. We all met Allison Fisher before, and Allison Fisher is the one who really herded cats throughout this whole process. In the not-for-profit community, we have Alicia Gaduti, Anne Rouet, and I do want to, and Anne has heard this story 100 times. And I have to tell it every time because I think it's so important. The commitment that every one of these team members had was just amazing and really inspiring for me. So we'll talk a little bit more about how we convened our two groups. But during our large lean week, it happened to be during the election week. So we were all working very, very hard in the morning, and I happened to turn over, and Anne was at my table, and I noticed Anne wasn't at the table. And I had said to someone, "Where's Anne? Anne is so important to this group." And it was election day, and at the end of the day, Anne had gone to the election polls and needed to poll for a little while. But during this whole process, she was running for a community seat, and she won. But I have to call out that story because it just demonstrates the commitment of every one of our partners. And then, of course, my friend, Secretary Ben Barnes. Without this, we could not have done it. Team sponsors were John Carl Casa from the Alliance and Ann Foley at OPM. Pam Trotman and David Gutchin were the team leads, and they keep us moving because we have subgroups. So this work is a work in progress. And then the facilitators, Isha Canada from DAS, Allison Fisher, Kristen Carr, and then my DPH, Lorianne Wagner. So thank you, Josh, if you'll go to the next slide. So these are some factoids, and this just gives background for the important work that not-for-profits are doing. So nonprofit agencies provide really the vast majority of human services in Connecticut. Those human services could be substance abuse, it could be child services, it could be developmentally disabled individual services. So it's a very, very important network in Connecticut. And those not-for-profits, in most cases, are licensed or have oversight from 10 different state agencies. In some cases, they have oversight of 3 agencies all at the same time, which can be very, very, very difficult when trying to manage your regulatory process. I thought this was interesting. In 2014, there were 1,585 human service contracts, and that accounts for $1.5 billion. So if we look at lean and we look at the efficiencies that we can gain, we know that there's a real incentive just to kind of work with the budget on this. And nonprofit and human service providers are a huge employer in Connecticut, and they employ 12% of the workforce. So, Stan.
When you look at what we're trying to achieve, you look at the 500,000 people that are involved in some fashion in the healthcare field broadly defined that are affected by the work that we all do in our agencies and the work that we do together. What we're trying to achieve is how to streamline the processes, how to take cost out as a savings to the state, a savings to the provider, and use those resources to more effectively provide the services that people are looking for and that we've all agreed are needed to happen. You want to click it? This is a process that's been some time in happening. With the onset of the recession in 2007, it progressively got tighter all the way around for all of us. And a few years ago, the governor's nonprofit liaison at the time brought a group of people together to try to do some streamlining of systems. And that led to the use of BizNet as a data repository, and it led to a uniform licensing application, which was great at that point, but this was now an effort to try to do something more. What happened in the last year's session, not this one just completed the year before, was the Connecticut Nonprofit Alliance introduced legislation about deemed status. This has been something that's happened in the past. And basically what that is if you hold an accreditation from a national accrediting body, it would exempt you from state licensure. There's pluses and minuses to that, and we had a lot of conversation about those and whether this was something that could really work. And so that bill was introduced, and it was really to reduce the cost of duplicative licensure, quality assurance kinds of processes that cost money, not necessarily in a visible sense, but do cost money in terms of the time that people spend away from serving the people who are receiving the services and working on the process pieces. So House Bill 6155 was introduced, and as we went through the process with the legislature, I remember meeting with some of our friends from DPH and members of the legislature and Alliance staff and having a discussion about all of this. We had conversations with the accrediting bodies in terms of what they did and didn't look at, and whether they could crosswalk with the regulatory process here in Connecticut. As we went through this, because of the effort that the state has done now for a number of years with using lean, and in particular with some of these agencies that were doing internal lean work already, an agreement formed to develop a lean project out of this. The unique aspect of this was not just a state agency project. This was one that was inclusive of the state agencies involved, as well as the private providers through the alliance. And that, we all think, has made all of the difference in terms of what we've been able to do so far and what we have coming down the road in terms of work as we go forward. As I said, it's a historic collaborative effort. And you mentioned the internal lean things, so you can look at things like DDS reduced the application processing. In the off year, it's a 2-year license, but every year you still had to fill an application. That's a time commitment on the provider end and on the DDS end in terms of somebody has to look at them. DPH moved to electronic visiting scheduling process, and DDS through their internal was looking at, instead of licensing 2 years, if you're deficiency free, your 3-year license. Again, savings. So how did we do all of this? We pulled the licensure and certification work group was pulled together. We had an opening kickoff session. And then in November, we had a 5-day Kaizen event where we were in a room together and we just worked this all out. And the important thing that we heard earlier was we all made sure we were really trying our best to listen. And I think that is huge in terms of being able to get where we got. After that, a lot of things were put together in terms of reporting out to the legislature and our sponsors, developing a series of subcommittees under the work group, bringing more people in to work in specific areas. Initial licensure process, renewal licensure process, the use of electronic records, off-site review, all of those pieces have been delegated out. We've brought more people into the process, both from state agencies and from the provider sector. We made presentations to key stakeholders, administrative staff, legislators, almost anybody who would listen. Our colleagues in the nonprofit agencies who were wondering what it was that we were talking about, and we brought them the information to the presentation. As I said, we've got ongoing efforts to keep things moving along and implement the recommendations. Excellent.
Sorry, Stan, you already said that.
Okay, we can go past that. And the impacted license types. So this is important to know because these were specified. And for some of us, if we have a community living arrangement and it's funded through the intermediate care program, we're also seeing DPH people. So you can see where there's that overlap. Public health and DEMIS overlap some things. So there are places where there's the overlap. So these were the impact of license types, and it's important to know because one of the things in the lean process is working from a scope. And this helped define our scope. All right.
Okay, next. So just to give you a very brief overview of some of the basic lean Kaizen framework strategies, how we view this work. A series of steps that you go through with any business process that you're looking to change. So first of all, you set a goal. What is it that we want to accomplish? We review where we're currently at, make sure we have information that's adequate about what our current state is. We identify things that need improvement, and then we implement those changes. And then we actually review it and see, did it have the intended effect? And then we report on the results. And we determine if we need to follow up and make some additional changes. So you may have heard Allison use this acronym, PDCA. If you're new to Lean, you'll get to know this very well, but it's a basic framework for trying to approach a change of any business process. Develop your hypothesis, run your experiment, evaluate your results, and then refine your experiment. Plan, do, check, act. Next slide. Okay, so some of the specific things that we did, I don't want to gloss over this first one too quickly because it really was a big deal. This was a group of the regulators and the regulated. And just pause for a moment and think about that. You're people that are in charge of issuing a license and those that have to comply with the requirements for that license. And so it was very important that we decide what can we agree on and how can we get there. And we really found that we agreed on quite a lot. And I think what you may see today in terms of our interaction with each other is what we discovered in this group, that we really had a lot in common of our common goals. Specific things that we needed to take on, clarifying the scope, because as Stan alluded to, not every license was included in this special act. It was very prescribed, specific license types. And as you can imagine, in the course of this work, we identified all kinds of things that we felt like needed to be changed or needed to be addressed. And we had to create a parking lot for those items and figure out what are we going to do with those because we don't want to ignore those. SIPOC is an acronym, suppliers, inputs, process, outputs, customers. It gives you a visual tool for seeing all the different things that are impacted by your business process, whatever it might be. In our case, issuing a license. So it gives you a real visual picture of all the different parts of the community that are impacted. And then the process mapping. This was probably one of the most interesting process tools. Actually writing down the steps that you go through in issuing a license and asking yourself, why are we doing that? Is it required by a law? Is it something that's in a contract somewhere? Is it just because we've always done it that way? Does it add any value whatsoever? And actually having the people that you regulate give you that feedback was a very, very interesting and helpful process. So the week that we had basically followed this outline. We reviewed the current status. We identified the non-value added steps. We created a list of recommendations, which we'll go into in quite a bit more detail later. We discussed the recommendations with our process stakeholders, most of whom were in the room, at least representatives were in the room. We identified the future ideal state, which you'll hear more about now, which involves a lot of electronic processing. Hopefully we'll get there. And a roadmap of how to achieve those goals. In our case, we developed a whole host of subcommittees that are going to carry this work forward in the future years. And we developed a communication plan. Initially, at least, it involved doing presentations like this to the heads of state agencies and also to representatives from the legislature. Just to give you a visual of how many entities, and individuals are impacted by this project, over 2,000 licensed settings were covered in this work group. That represents well over 10,000 individuals that our state agencies serve. So this was not a small undertaking by any stretch. Next slide. All right, so some of the things that we agreed on, these were really important things that we all agreed had to be in place as we move forward, which increased and improved communications and trust. And I want to take a second on that last word, trust, because in any regulatory environment, there can be that question of whose agenda is going forward here. Is it just a bureaucratic agenda, or do these people really understand what I do? And I think probably as important of anything that came out of this process was an ability to understand each other's side of the fence, so to speak, and in some ways eliminate that fence. Consistent timelines and interpretation of the licensure process. I think the thing that we all agreed on is that we really want providers to succeed, and the best way for them to succeed is for there to be a clear understanding of what the expectations are, to have those expectations applied consistently and uniformly, to have a lot of transparency so people understand what I'm going to be evaluating on. And so that is a very key piece. Continued training and support, both for state agency staff and for provider staff. Enhanced provider readiness for site visits. We really want people to get through an inspection with very few, if any, citations. So the best way to do that is to make sure they have all the tools they need to actually have everything in place. And then we made a commitment that we really need to revisit this process at least every 5 years to make sure that we don't need to make some additional changes.
So here we are, being together. Actually, we made a commitment when we first joined in that it was going to be one day. And I told my staff, we'll be one day, working with other state agencies that actually license and create the regulations for us as providers. Well, it turned into be 5 days when we got there. Allison, in her very gentle, kind, unintrusive way, said, "You're here for 5 days." I'm like, "Oh, okay, we're here for 5 days." You basically, with Allison, you do what you're told when you're in the room. But this was an experience that we felt really needed to happen. And I think when I heard today the importance of effective teams and the piece about listening, we did need to listen to each other. And I think that, I want to reinsert the importance of trust. Remember, we have the regulators, and then we have those of us who are regulated. So it was really important, I think, to break down those barriers. And I won't forget to say, Barbara had mentioned, she goes, "We've really never sat down with providers like this before." And you could almost feel the barrier, set up. But those were broken down, and I love the whole analogy of friends, because we certainly are now. This is, so now we're into the final days. So we needed to come up with the recommendations. So how long have we been saying no more paper? For how many years? Once the computer came in front of us, we won't have any more paper. As providers, and certainly as the public officials, that paper can still be important in terms of regulating. So we were very clear. One of our recommendations were going to be no more paper, and specifically as it related to electronic service records. And I want to go right into the second one, because the sharing of information. So sometimes when a child goes out of DCF and goes into the DDS system more actively, we don't have a lot of information as providers, and neither do those state agencies. So it was important to make sure that one of our recommendations was that data sharing across agencies and providers using the e-licensing, which we've now learned much more about e-licensing over the last few months, BizNet, which as providers we've been using for quite some time, and or the electronic service records. Depending on the size agency that you might be, some of us had that capacity and some of us did not. The electronic records and access recommendations proposed for off-site and on-site use and training. The electronic approvals, it was sort of crazy. We're doing some things online, but then we would need to have, what are you, Barbara?
Notary.
She did a notary. We had to have the notary. So we knew there were some, so I was making sure you're awake. So we had to make sure that, we would have the signature of the executive director or CEO, sign it. So the good news is that was actually changed through legislation this session. So some of these recommendations have already had activity and have been active and passed. The electronic mobile process for visits and documentation. We're really excited about that, so that even for a public official that comes in to do the licensing, some of that mobile process, having, DDS I know is going in that direction, having all of that documentation in preparation, but have it on electronic device. And then the ongoing technical support and training. As providers, some of us are at different levels in terms of information technology. Within our organization, we have an IT person, but many nonprofit providers, whether you contract with DCF or DDS or directly with DPH, don't have that support. So our recommendation is that we seek out more. You can get me awake here, Josh?
Yeah,
Okay.
you good?
Prep visits and discussion before renewal. I love this idea. This means that somebody coming from a state agency into the provider can do more information at their desk. And as an agency, we would provide that information to them in advance. So rather than having all of the resources from a private agency out there on a visit, they can provide a lot of that information in advance of the actual visit. So for us, we were very excited about that. We talked about the use of desk, and it's going to reduce so much time. I don't know how many, all of you from the public at this point? No. So whether you're from the state or the private sector, I all of a sudden felt intimidated when nobody raised their hand. It's a lot of resource on both sides. The announced renewal visits for licensure, we're very excited. We do get that under the DDS contract. There is a schedule of when you'll come out to license, but it's the intermittent ones. And so there was some legislation around that of which DDS supported as well as the private providers. And I think that's the partnership piece, is that there was legislation that both the state agencies and the private providers were in support of. And how often does that happen? Not very often in my history. The tiered system for renewal licensing compliance issues. This is, I don't contract with DCF, but based on DCF weighted scoring methodologies, and Jim has taught us a lot in terms of what that is and the CMS scope. The use of photos to communicate the violations and corrections. So I don't know about you, but as facilities, we have group homes, and it'd be really nice to take a picture and say, okay, it has been corrected. The citation that was given us has been corrected. We're going to do it in a photo, send it to you, and we're done. Click.
I think we skipped this one.
Oh, what do we skip?
I got, I told
You
you
did.
I was trigger happy over here,
Oh,
so I, yeah.
I went right to the, okay.
Yeah.
This one's important, the review and streamline the provider pre-qualification. One of the subcommittees is to look at the, both the licensing and the, how do you pre-qualify, to be licensed. I don't think I'm touching on that enough, am I, Josh?
So the idea is that you might go through a certification or qualification process with an agency or an entity, and if you've done that to establish your criteria as an approved provider, we shouldn't make you continue to resubmit those same items to us repeatedly every single time you want to relicense a home, right?
Right.
So if we know who your board of directors are, and we know about your bylaws and everything has been accepted, why do I need them every time? You tell me when they change, submit them once, we have them, and that's a much, much more streamlined way of us working together.
I'm looking at Barbara because she does this all through business and through with our agency, so it's been really, significantly a time saver. Uniform initial licensing application, all in electronic format and uploaded to eLicense and BizNet. And you know, we work primarily with DDS and we're just learning, we're getting some training about e-licensing, so that is going to be significantly a time-saving effort on both sides. The state agency, we talked about the desk audit, how important that is to ensure the complete applications are done, and the limit for the on-site visit, and again, the resource of people that are always at that visit. And then the announced visits, the initial visits for licensure, we already get, and I think that's going to be new for some of the agencies that DPH actually license. Am I done yet?
You have
These are the process recommendations. I know you gave me the longest this is going back to November of 2017. And what's exciting is, and we talked about the subcommittee, some of this work is already taking action. And having been involved with other task force and other groups, this is probably the most active group that's really making things happen and making the recommendations that were proposed in November realized. So this is alignment across agency regulations to achieve consistency. Oh my God, doesn't that make sense? You know, so that if DCF requires something and you're a provider that both contracts with DCF and DDS and has potentially a relationship with DEMIS, you know, that they all sort of match and, you know, not have duplication. Invite individuals receiving services and supports to take part in the licensing visits. We're all about having satisfaction, not only of the employees, but the individuals we support. So I think having those individuals there to ensure that people are receiving the services, and you know, who else better to validate it than the people that are actually receiving the supports. Reduce the duplication between quality assurance processes and licensing. This may not be true with some state agencies, but with DDS, and I hate to pick on them, but there's a lot of oversight. Not too much, Joss, but a lot. So there is, you know, we're trying to reduce that duplication, and you know, what better to do that than to come up with recommendations to make that happen. DEMIS, although they are not licensed, should also engage in this lean process to really examine their contract monitoring. And they were a part of this process, but it's a little different. They're not licensed facilities. Or I should say they're not licensed by DEMIS.
Correct.
But by DDH. I've learned a lot. Uniform renewal license application, sort of the development of the application and the site visits checklist. Fillable applications online. I mean, everything we do now is an online fillable for whether you fill out a credit application or whatever it might be. Why not do it for this whole process? And then the training, communications training on the new licensure processes for agencies and provider staff, learning management systems, you know, e-learning, access broadens. I have to say that over the last few months, there have been a lot of information on training that we can access as providers that we had no knowledge of before. I think this is my last slide.
It is.
Okay. This is
Home stretch.
I know, this is the license, are y'all awake? Okay, this is good. There's a test afterwards as well. This is one of these recommendations are really important. The license, regulate, and inspect state-operated agencies. I mean, this was a large discussion. You know, what are there dual standards between, you know, whether DDS home is licensed versus a private provider. So we're going to be really looking at that, right, Josh?
Absolutely.
Standardized web-based medication administration certification. Out of this whole 5 days, there was one thing, as I think most of the people who were in those 5 days, that I felt was so important, and that's the whole med certification. DCF does it one way, DDS does it another way, so, and DPH has their way. Our hope is, no, it's not our hope, the goal is
Yes.
that we will all be sitting at the expectation is that we're going to create one med certification program that's online, which right now DCF does online, and you know, make it one.
Can you give an example of that?
An example is, well, as an employer, So if somebody comes in from DCF and they're med certified, under DCF, I can't accept them as an employee. They have to take DDS med certification. So even though the information is very similar, and the test is very similar, the certifications don't cross.
There's no reciprocity, so she would have to ask the person to come in and do another 5 days of training to get that certification to provide meds, even though DCF group home that they already worked in for the last 6 years would have said it's fine for them to pass meds in the DCF group home because Ann is funded and regulated by DDS, and they're switching their licenses with DDS, and they're switching employers. They'd have to go through the training all over again.
Yeah, and
Oh,
I'll
they're
just.
web-based, or what do you
Yes.
mean
Oh, the
by
web-based,
Oh, that's-
yes.
Yeah, it would be
Very
like
good.
an distance learning system where you might watch videos and then take tests, you'd answer questions online.
Okay.
And you know, in our community, the staff work multiple jobs and they work across agencies. So it puts a real burden on the providers, but it also puts a real burden on the individuals, the staff.
Mhm.
Yeah, employee may have 2 different certifications, and why not have one? So it's
So
going
the
to be
so the training is online, so they
Okay.
watch a video instead of having to sit in a classroom for
Okay,
5
okay.
days and be taught by a trainer, and then they would be, physically, they demonstrate they've got the skills to do the pass and pour of the medications, they'd be supervised by a nurse to be able to say, yes, we agree you're good, but doing it online allows them to do it in between shifts or at home, reduces travel costs, lots of personnel expenses.
For the provider agency, not paying the person for those days, not paying for travel costs depending on when those things land, is a significant savings. And so much has moved to online education, college degrees. You name it, it's online. The
But
difference.
how are you handling the security of it though? That you're gonna have, like, have them have a, particular question, that someone else can go online and do this for them?
There's
have-
a series of security-based logins that people will have. They will have to do some identification. It can be monitored through a learning management system. And there'd be multiple varieties of the tests so that you could maintain that security.
If I could
That's
just
all
say,
known
it's
technology.
not going to be easy.
Yes.
We are in the
Maybe
process.
maybe you guys can use a webcam so they take their pictures. There was somebody else sat there and did it for you.
In our
That's a good idea,
subcommittee,
yeah.
Uh-huh.
we have a subcommittee that is a very diverse group. Ann and I sit on the subcommittee. And there's been lots of discussions about marrying the 3 different curriculums. Because essentially the curriculum is all the same. There may be separate nuances that are related to DCF and DDS and DPH, but the goal is to marry them all together. And to your point, and to Stan's point, we spent probably 90 minutes last week just talking about the security components, that if Barbara Cass is taking the test, how does Ann Ruay, as the CEO of CCARC, how can she be convinced that it's actually me taking the test? So that's an issue that we are taking very seriously, and we will build it into the new program. And I think just evidenced by the discussion that we've had, this was really an important issue for the group, that we have one training program, and it falls in line with the goals of Lean, just being more efficient. And why can't DPH honor DDS's training curriculum? It's absurd.
I have a friend with a care provider. What happened was, I was a care provider at one time to this person. And she would tell me about her friend. Oh, she had a friend, and so he would call her niece or someone. Oh, he told me she had a baby and I don't like it. She didn't know that he could see everything through the phone, and she actually didn't want to know, But in this case, you do want to know, so that's a
Absolutely.
security thing.
So we've had lots of discussion about the security and the integrity of not only the training, but particularly the exam. So we that's to be continued. And that's one of so we had the shortest goal, the timeline. So we've been given a little bit of a cushion. The initial goal was that by July of this year, we would have a training curriculum that we all agreed upon. We know now that probably wasn't the most realistic time frame. So we have now till the fall to come up with a training curriculum. But we have a great group, a dedicated group, and a smart group.
Great.
So I have the best subcommittee.
I'm not sure I agree with that. No. It's very diverse, and I think if you can imagine, when we talk about change, you know, DCF has done it a certain way, DDS has done it a certain way, and DPH, actually, to their credit, took the best of both of those and created their own. But now we want one, which, you know, it makes so much, it's all about dispensing medication safely to the individuals, and I think, you know, that's what we all want to do, whether you're a private provider or whether you're a public official. So it is so important, but it is the questions that are coming up from the subcommittee now are ones that I would have never thought, you know, we needed to raise. So, but it's all very good.
For how long is that individual supervised until you're sure that she or he
Can actually
understand?
pass.
Mhm.
Well, it will not. What we've all decided, it
That's
will
on the
never
job,
take away
on the
from the
job.
the passive core
Yeah,
that's
practical.
required, the practical piece of it. That but it'll take away the actual test, the learning and the test. So, but you can never take away, because you want to make sure, you know, that the on-site competence of that employee is such that they can dispense it in a safe way for those individuals. So, you know, there's some pieces that we're all in agreement with. It's just what can we agree on, particularly for the online training and testing. So I'm most excited about this. I'm glad you are too. Just by
Well,
the
yeah, also, I mean, do you do background checks on these individuals?
Well, all right now,
Yes.
you know, they would have to be employees. So as a private agency, we do background tests, you know, significant background tests. So, yes, we don't want anyone coming in. There has been some discussion in the group, now that you bring it up, that potentially a person who wants to come into an agency, you know, have the opportunity for taking that certification, but we're not there yet. You know, but I think, you know, that's not a bad idea too. As an employer, it would be great to have somebody come in already ready, you know, and not have to extend sending them out to training and just do the on-site. But I don't think that recommendation's in here.
I just want to say something. I don't want to take up the whole, you know, too much of your time. But I took a medical class. After that class, I don't ever trust anybody again. I really watch them before they say they're a doctor or a nurse. There was one person in the working at the home, a patient, and so when the new nurse came in, I think she was an RN or something, and she thought he was a colleague. He was actually a patient, but he was a doctor before he was a patient. So he was still acting as a doctor, and she didn't know until one day one of the other people that worked there said something to him, and she goes, "Oh, he's not a doctor? All that time, he does everything exactly right. Only thing is, when time for the paycheck, he would be mad because he didn't get a paycheck."
The value of staff photo ID.
Yeah.
Right?
After that, I'll never trust any
Yeah.
police stop. You know, you gotta really be sure.
Yeah, we do have, I know most employers now in the private sector do have photo IDs and can identify them and have to have their certification
Yeah.
card on them. So some of those things will, boy, that's so scary. All right, so I lost where I am. Eliminate the DCF licensure requirement of DDS continuous residential supports. Those are CRSs that are in the DCF system. But we also have in the DDS, the DDS system as well. Eliminate, I know this sounds so ridiculous, eliminate DDS $50 application licensing fee for CLAs, community living arrangements. We would have to pay $50, write out a separate check. And of course, OPM was a little concerned about this, what is the revenue loss, but there really was no revenue. It was so nominal that they were in agreement, and it did pass through the legislature, so that's another one we've had success on already. Clarify DDS unannounced licensing visits. That was another recommendation that went through the legislature and has had some statutory changes, which is great. The removal of the notary requirements, we talked about that a little bit already. That has also been through legislative action changed. And then compress the 8 licensure categories to 5. And I know that's DPH, that's already happened.
It's in process.
Or in process.
Close.
All right.
So that's exciting. Am I done now?
You're done.
Graduated.
Okay.
You're certified.
So as we think about lean, most organizations use lean internally within like-minded groups, within a unit or a function of the same organization. So this exercise was actually very unique because it was the regulators and those that are regulated. So we really entered into a totally different world than typical lean processes. And I know for Allison being the facilitator, it gave her a little bit of trepidation, and it was sort of an experiment. And I think you can probably tell that this is a really positive experiment and has huge ramifications for how the state works with their nonprofit providers and probably in many other systems. So just that's my soapbox. But many of us have all been parts of initiatives and processes where you're really excited and you spend all this time and energy and you have these great recommendations and then they go on a shelf. And then somebody says, hey, what happened to those? And they're still sitting on the shelf. And it's because you leave off without a real clear plan for how are you going to implement these changes. And we were adamant. I was in the same boat as Ann. I thought I was volunteering for a one-day effort. Ended up 5 days. Sort of we felt like we were locked in a room, but we really were committed to making this work, and we were committed to making it work in the long term. So we really were thoughtful about how are we going to govern and implement and move some of these changes forward over the long term. So we took our group of 24 members, and we really made that was the core of the licensing work group, and committed to meeting monthly. And we're going to do that until we're, I think, probably in perpetuity, or until we think we've addressed all of the issues. But then we also decided we needed help, so we split that group into subcommittees, and we have 8 subcommittees that now have expanded. So they include additional nonprofit representatives and additional state agency representatives that are really more broadening our expertise to get this work done. Then each of us on the core group decided we would take some leadership role so that we could bring back some of the tools that we used in the Lean Week and really some of the ground rules and some of the focus of what is our function here. So we're leading these subcommittees, and we're doing it all under the coordination of OPM, and that's really important because when you're asking state agencies to commit time and energy and resource, and you're asking providers, you need to know that there's support from the top, and it doesn't get much higher up than OPM leading this effort. So we have a subcommittee that is working on digital records and EMR, electronic medical records, and human resource records access, and that's huge. And when we thought about these subcommittees, we really tried to pull apart what are the key issues that are going to need some real additional help and additional energy put into. We have a work group that's looking at the initial license application and those recommendations. Legislation and regulation, and all of these work groups have different timelines, so the legislation and regulation work group had a very short timetable because we finished in November, and they had some bills that they had to try to get passed this session. So I'm pleased to say we got 4 bills passed this session that just started from the conclusion of our work in November. So pretty significant changes and quick changes, because that's also key to having any effort be successful, is early on victories really help to sustain the effort. The med certification work group that Barbara and Ann talked about, renewal license and compliance work group, and those decided to work together. And they're really looking at issues like, should the tear on the couch be the same level of compliance issue as a health and safety issue, like somebody passing medication that doesn't have the right certification? And how do we tier those and tier them consistently? We have a research committee that's looking at how are other states handling these license and certification issues? Is there someone that's doing it well? And how can we capitalize on that and use some of those best practices? And then a training and communications subcommittee, because all of this really is going to need to be rolled out across the nonprofit system and across the state agency system in some consistent way. So I talked about key performance indicators, and we really thought about what are our strategies and what are the things that we want to achieve. And we are approaching these with some pretty, I think, aggressive and optimistic timelines. So I talked about the statutory changes, but those were related to licensure fees, to the notary signature, which we are now not required to have, and then reducing some of the significant duplicative licensure requirements. And we did it. We got 4 bills passed. We had a 4-bill agenda. We had providers and the legislative staff of the state agencies working together, and we were able to get 4 bills passed. Now we're taking that the next level, which is, can we align the regulations so that we don't have very different looking regulations that are covering licensing and certification from each of the state agencies. That's a more significant process, but we've really got a good foothold and a pathway forward with that. Uniform med-admin certification, so we talked about that with a goal of having some outcome, some product by September 30th. We said we've got a benchmark. What are our outcomes looking at? So 20% on-site time of licensure and provider staff should be reduced, and that's, we're saying they spend 9 hours in that initial license on-site and 18 hours for a renewal license. We're looking at significant reductions in that time, and that's really the desk audit piece. It's the qualifications, it's the checklist, so providers know when someone's showing up at their agency, what are the specific documents they're gonna wanna see, and let's have them ready and prepared, instead of the, hi, we're here, and these are the 20 things, and it's a surprise to you. And that was actually really, I'm watching the clock, Josh. An interesting takeaway is that we kind of moved culturally from a gotcha idea of licensure is out to catch you doing things, catch the providers doing things they shouldn't be doing, to a, we're all partners in this together, and the goal is providing quality care. And that was a definite evolution from that very first initial meeting to our last day of our 5-day Kaizen in understanding the culture and why we're all here and why we're all doing this. And that to me was also probably the most significant takeaway. Reducing 50% on-site time requirement for provider staff, so that's huge. It's quite disruptive when a licensing inspector shows up unexpectedly and hands you a list of things they want, and you're running a group home, and you don't have the manager there, and you don't have the HR records there, and you're quickly rushing. So hopefully some of the steps we've put in place will really reduce some of that panic and some of that, the burdensome time that you're taking away from serving clients. And then provider satisfaction surveys. No one's ever asked the providers, are you happy with how this goes? What do you think of this licensing process? And we thought that was an important piece that was missing. So additional opportunities for improvement. We talked about some other areas that were out of scope for our licensure and certification legislation that we'd like to look at, including ICFs in the DD side, psychiatric residential treatment facilities. Talked about the certificate of need process. I'm just gonna fly through these.
Great.
Process for initial license for a new facility versus a relocation. So you've got your license, but you move offices down the street. Do you really need to go through the same extensive process again? Or is there a simplified process for that? Quality service review. So this is the quality systems versus the licensing systems, and how can we kind of reduce and lean those processes? And then all of this costs money, so are there opportunities for capital improvement bonding money for providers? Oof, I feel like I
Nice
talked
job.
really fast, sorry.
All right, I'm gonna make a commitment to lean my normal presentation methodology because I can go on and on sometimes. But the great news is this wonderful team really covered a lot of information that I may just breeze over again. Our progress to date, we're really proud of this. What we've accomplished in the short amount of time is really some of the things that are like the gold standard for lean events. Lean focuses on people, process, and technology. But often when we do a Kaizen or a 5-day intensive process improvement methodology, you don't have any real money on the table for new technology. You don't have any hope that you're ever going to change regulation or legislation. And you're very, very skeptical that you can even engage all the people to commit to one course of action in a continued methodology. But because of the help of the history, how this came about, the special act, the support of the legislators and the legislation requiring us to do that, we were able to accomplish that. We were able to lead with that. Typically, you might make some quick improvements and then hope that maybe in a year or 2 or 3, you might get some regulatory or some statutory changes or some legislative changes. We've already accomplished that. So that has really paved the way and opened up the path for us to make a lot of new improvements. And the group is starting to collaborate on aligning those regulatory processes. If anyone's ever read regulation, which I have, it is very intensive And to even imagine or say that you could align regulations across agencies, someone might think that you needed help. But we are helping each other do it. The work group is working together. We can't really stress enough the med-admin. That is huge. That was unexpected. It came up during the course of this in discussion. That would never, ever had happened. Someone might have had the idea, but they would have dismissed it rapidly as something that's totally impossible to accomplish. However, we realized through getting to know each other and through discussing and learning what an impact it has, how burdensome that is on the providers. And as state agencies, we embraced the idea. We had to. We have to embrace the idea that we can do business differently. This idea of taking an approach to understanding the severity of the compliance issues is very, very important. Alicia mentioned that. Do we treat the tear in the rug or the couch the same as we treat someone getting the wrong medication or someone suffering abuse or neglect or something like that? And yes, today, one deficiency is one deficiency. One not met is one not met. We kind of approach it all, one size fits all. There's a survey that's being developed that will help us understand what the providers are seeing in their experience around the differences between most of your regulatory citations coming out of the area that's not really impactful to the individual's life or their health and safety. And if that's the case, then we need to really figure out how to handle that differently. The idea of getting to know what different training systems all the providers and all the state agencies are using is incredibly important when we want to do a lot of education. We want to do a lot of outreach. We want to meet people where they are. So we want to develop solutions for education and training that everyone can use and that's a good fit for the current systems that people have. So before we can do that, we need to know what people are using. And what we're finding is there's a very large variety. And some of our providers are totally electronic. Some state agencies are still more classroom-based. So there's a real continuum. And our hope is that we can really find ways to reduce the amount of time that it takes to get people trained and give people solutions that works for everybody. And finally, the state agencies are going to continue to do their internal lean processes. Before we all got together for that wonderful week, and I will give a disclaimer, I was at Disney for 3 of those days. I got to come back from vacation and join the group, and you guys had done most of that hard work.
Yeah.
I did put my time in at DDS before that. We did, we laid the foundational work for the changes that were discussed today, like extending a 3-year license and reducing by 50% the applications because we stopped something that made no sense, which is make providers submit an application on an off year when they don't need to and they're not getting inspected. So what did we learn through this process? We learned so much. Hopefully we've shared a little bit about what we've learned. But focusing on the processes and not the people allowed us to be comfortable and talk about things that are really difficult that people felt passionately about. So we had real differences in our positions when we began. When we ended the process, well, we're still in it, but when we ended that week, there was a lot more alignment. Why was there more alignment? Because no one took it personally. We were able to really talk about the process and not focus on the person. Also, 5 agencies and 20 people in 1 week, 5 days, could resolve some long-standing issues. These issues have been talked about for probably 20 years or more. No one thought that we could do anything about it. We were made to do something about it, and we did, and it was wonderful. Sharing these individual agency processes with each other was very enlightening. So sometimes you do something within your own organization that makes sense to you, but when you have to tell other people about it and they start asking you questions, you say, I don't really know why we do that, and it's really hard to justify it and explain it. And so I think we learned a lot about ourselves through this process. There is a real cultural change at place. It's great that morning presentation was wonderful, and it reinforced how change can be very difficult. And we're at the leading part of the change, so we're still in that difficult phase. But we know that if we stay the course, we're going to see amazing results from this. And Lean really provided the platform for us to do this and to work together. Lean is a wonderful tool that has many methods and other tools that you can use. We talked about some of the things we did, the process mapping, using the SIPOC analysis. It really created a framework and a structure for us to work together on. And just a note is that expect more of these, expect more multi-agency, possibly legislatively required liens. Everybody that was involved in this gets that that's very effective. You get results when it's required through legislation. And also, it's a powerful tool for change for things that are sticking points that have been hard to change for a long, long time. So we're looking at that for the governor's cabinet and nonprofit health and human services is looking at that for the rate setting for nonprofits. And fiscal impact? We didn't do an in-depth analysis yet of the potential savings on the provider side and the state side. When we quantify that, we'll probably get pretty large numbers. This is kind of the fun part of the fiscal impact. We're talking about the $50. Why would DDS give up $50 per provider per application? It probably costs the state more than $50 to get that $50.
Right.
Just having to have someone go get the mail, and the provider had to write the check and send it in to us, and we have to get the mail, and then the business office processing, ins and outs, transferring to other state agencies who would then have multiple other things that they would do with that money. It just didn't make sense to us. It was an easy win. It was an easy way to say, hey, we're going to get rid of that. It eases the administrative burden a little bit. So there are technology improvements that may result in additional costs. Clearly, if we're going to EHR standards, we're going to have new systems in place. We will definitely be looking at costs. So looking at the state budget, and we were working in a little bit of a tighter budget climate at that time. So we were starting to look around at what are some other sources of funding. And I think some state agencies are very used to that, looking for federal dollars or nonprofit dollars or foundation money. And we all weren't on the same page with that. So we're going to continue to explore those ways to get funding for these initiatives, such as the nonprofit grant program, the IT capital investment program, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and the Ford Foundation. And we're really just at the beginning of this process. We're very energized, as you can tell by the amount of change that we've been able to accomplish to date. And we have a plan in place that we think will see us through. And we really are committed to the multi-year engagement to get to, by 2021, 50% reduction in on-site time.
So are there any questions? Lots of work was done during this week. We've compressed it into 30 minutes. And that in and of itself was a Herculean event. But we have probably 30 seconds for questions, unless you would like to stay.
We will totally stay and talk.
Yes. Yes.
Can we sign you guys up for the criminal justice system? Let's
You can invite us. You can invite us to present to your group, probably. Yeah.
Yes.
The notary, the legislation
Yes.
change, what was that exactly?
So DPH required, well, did DDS
DDS.
require it as
DDS
well?
as well.
So the application process required the application to be notarized. So that in and of itself precluded a lot of forward movement in that you can't notarize an electronic application. So there's really no value added. So that was not a pink. So anyone who has done a lien event knows that a lot of it is governed by sticky notes. That was not at DPH, a pink sticky note. No value added to that. So the government liaisons did that in their legislative bill, and it was an easy pass-through.
Is it specific to your agencies or is it statewide?
Yeah.
It's
Specific
DPH
to
and
DPH and DDS.
Sorry.
DDS.
But it,
But let's
it
do it.
provides
Let's do it.
But that- but
it
that's something to
provides a
build on.
great platform for now other state agencies to look at that and say, if it wasn't mandatory for a DDS group home serving some of the most vulnerable clients. Why is it necessary in so many other avenues? And why can we not look at using some of these as real benchmarks for moving systems change forward, right?
And the concept with value added is just so relevant. Is there value added? I thought it was telling the $50 for
Yeah.
CLAs, and it costs more than $50 to just execute those dollars. So,
Yeah, if you think about
value added.
in your work life, there are probably so many different examples you can think of where it costs you more time and effort, energy, probably dollars to do some of the things you're doing.
Mhm.
So the lesson I took from what we did is all the time in my organization, I'm thinking, what is the reason I'm doing this? Is there a value to it? And if not, can I do it differently? Can I eliminate a step? I mean, this was huge and transformative for me in my life, you know, in many ways, because it taught some really important skills for how we approach. Everybody needs to do things more efficiently and quicker and leaner, and this really provides a great framework for being able to do that in multiple parts of your work.
so I think the concept of this is the way we do it, not only it lived strongly at DPH, but I suspect it lives in every organization, and it's just changing that concept. Well, this is the way we do it, and we know how to do it this way. But don't let that be the reason why you continue to do something that just doesn't make sense.
And if I could just mention, you need to constantly challenge yourself to be thinking in this direction.
Yes.
One of the things that came out, and we've referenced the e-license platform as where we're going on a forward basis to be able to process all of the information through. And some people were familiar with it to some level, some weren't. We saw a couple of small groups saw some in-person demonstration. And then it bubbled up that, gee, we should be looking at doing some large group events so that people can learn about this. And as we were talking it through, the proverbial light bulb turned on and said, well, why don't we look at this from a lean standpoint, and what's the cost of having people drive from all over the state to a particular place to have this demonstration? And what we've put together is the plan, and it's moving along, a recorded webinar that can get pushed out to all of the state agencies, all of the providers, and whether that's done on, click a link on a state website that you can view it, or for us, we're a larger agency, we have a learning management system. We can put this on our learning management system. We can put it into people's libraries in terms of, you need to do this, here's your time frame. We get an attestation that they've done that. And we've saved all kinds of travel time. We've given people the opportunity to learn it at their own pace, at their own time when it works for them, so that they are going to know going forward how they need to do their part in the licensure process. So it's that constant thinking about everything we're doing. What would lean do here? Is one of the major benefits out of all of our participation in this process.
Any other questions?
You're mostly, you said, in the public sector, all of you, the process that they're talking about?
No, we're the three of us are private providers, nonprofit
They're
providers.
nonprofit providers.
We're
But
nonprofit
I
providers.
think the lean process of using it, I mean, right now, it's funded by the state.
You would
but-
probably have less red tape to go through than a state agency would, right?
Well, our agency actually utilized Webster. They're right down the street. They don't call it lean, but we were able to access them for free to come in and look at some of our processes for how we can do things a little leaner. And but we don't have in the private sector.
Well, to address that though,
We're all funded.
they're overseen because they're funded by all of these agencies. That is really the reason that we did this, because they're living with DDS's rules, DPH's
Yeah,
rules,
that's-
DEMIS's rules,
Yeah.
and DCF's rules, so they don't really have the ability to make the easy change. Some things they have more control of, some they have no control of, and they have to comply with those 3 or 4 different regulations or set of expectations.
And
so.
we have national accreditation. So
There
we
you
have
go.
all
More.
these different shades of red tape, I suppose, because of all the different regulators, and none of them align. So that was part of this effort, and that's my self-interest in doing this, and probably yours is, can we get these requirements to align in some way so that it reduces all of this burdensome administrative costs and
We would have to partner
inefficiencies.
with the state on any of those. I was thinking more internally,
Yeah.
but, definitely it has such value. I think we were the only lean Connecticut process that was inclusive of the private providers, from what Allison has shared. So, I think she was reluctant early on, but I think now she knows it could work with many other state agencies as well, so.
I think the important takeaway for all of us is this really enhanced the quality of care for the people that we're all serving, because we are promoting efficiencies. So at the end of the day, the consumer, the patient, the client, whatever we want to call that person, is the one who's benefiting from this.
It's that 500,000 number at the beginning.
Yes, yes.
Huge impact.
So thank you for your attention.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
If you have any
Enjoy
other
the rest of
questions
the day.
today, come grab us and we're happy to talk.